Now we have Anna Zalik, who is professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University and a leading scholar on extractive industries and resistance in Canada, Mexico, and Nigeria. Her many articles and chapters include Rethinking the Extractive Productive Binary Under Neoliberalism, Wealth and Oil, No Change There, Displacement and Denationalization, the Mexican Gulf 75 Years After Expropriation, and Marketing and Militarizing Elections, Social Protest, Extractive Security, and the Delegitimization of Civilian Transition in Nigeria and Mexico. So make sure to check those out. Thank you.
Anyway, many thanks to Dick and Colin and to Tanner and Greg and all who've organized, and thank you, Paloma. So, the other day I was speaking with Tanya about some of the things that I'm worried about, and I was saying, I'm not so sure that we can count on López Obrador to deliver on the promise to reverse the energy reform that was implemented in 2013. And Tanya looked at me sort of, how naive can you be, kind of look, saying, Anna, he's not an anti-capitalist. This is not an anti-capitalist sort of government that's just come into power. So I think that, that's one thing, I suppose, for this audience to be thinking about in terms of the history that sort of López Obrador represents. But sort of on a more positive note, I first sort of encountered his weight in Mexican politics doing research in Tabasco 15 years ago and continuing to do research in Tabasco State, which is where he's from originally, over the years. And what's really sort of notable is that while internationally people are not necessarily, until recently, quite aware of who López Obrador is, in Mexico he was very much propelled to the national stage because of the fact that he led campesino organizations who were protesting against Pemex for the damage that the oil industry had done to their lands, and this goes back to the early 90s. And so, in that earlier research, I actually compared him to Ken Saro-Wiwa, who among certain kinds of left activists would be sort of a household name in the West, or in the Anglophone West, whereas López Obrador was not well known, although in the same period that the Saro-Wiwa story was being told internationally, López Obrador appeared within Mexico on national television with sort of a bloodied head after being beaten by security forces leading a protest of campesino groups who were concerned with the implications of ecological degradation of their land. And that particular moment many people refer to as a moment that kind of led to his popularity nationally, the fact that he had led this mobilization. So, as much as he is seen now as somebody who defends the national industry, the national oil industry, he had this history of also being very, being one of the key people who critiqued it. And so I just wanted, around that to kind of give a couple of anecdotes that I think show the sort of varying positions of different kinds of people on the left, progressive, left in Mexico that I know over the years. So one comes from 2006. In 2006, the Zapatistas led a campaign across the country known as the Other Campaign, La Otra Campaña, where they basically called for people not to vote in the elections because of the level of impunity and general sense of corruption that accompanied all of the parties. And at that point, López Obrador was the leader of the PRD before he split off after the 2012 elections. And so La Otra Campaña traveled across the country, and in one of the visits that they made in Tabasco State, as they were crossing from Tabasco State to Veracruz, I was with a group of social activists who were traveling with them, and I was talking to somebody from one of the NGO's left groups in Tabasco about the position of La Otra Campaña about the elections, and he said, look, I completely support the general position of the Zapatistas, and I think it's really good that we're critiquing the overall political structure here, but I can tell you one thing, I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote for López Obrador. And so, he was very aware of the fact that this is somebody who represented the real grassroots opposition in Tabasco, because as I encountered doing research in 2004, 2006 and onwards, that basically, most communities that you go to in the municipalities in Tabasco, if you go to sort of a local campesino leader's home, they're all like, well, when Andres Manuel was here, they all know him personally and by his first name. So, he is somebody who, as Tanya pointed out, really came out of civil society organizations. He is seen as sort of a legitimate person from the kind of grassroots organization, certainly in Tabasco. So the second, example is of a cousin of mine where, 2 weeks ago, election night, I'm all super excited, posting on Facebook, congratulations everyone. And one of my cousins responds, oh, please, Anna, really, I think I see Lopez Obrador as just the same as more or less all the others. I actually went to this special voting booth where you could write in whoever you wanted, and I wrote in the name of Mari Choi, who was the indigenous candidate who was initially going to run sort of on a Zapatista kind of ticket and then pulled out. So, so there is this kind of general sort of sense that the broader political movements of the party movements that Lopez Obrador has been with historically are part of the problem. But I think that, this resurgence of Morena has changed that, and one of the things that has circulated a lot in social media in the last few weeks, again, a couple of interesting anecdotes. One that was sent to me, I'm not sure if it's real or not, is of Michelle and Barack Obama wearing Lopez Obrador t-shirts. I don't know if this was Photoshop, but I thought it sort of said something about the kind of, the way some people might be thinking about the future. I mean, people saw this as a positive thing, so you can understand, what that represents. But I thought it's also interesting because I think that there is a parallel in the sense that, at the moment of Obama's election, a lot of people were commenting on the fact that it's precisely when the U.S. is in financial crisis that there's finally an African-American president, right? So it's at a moment of real crisis that sort of the powers that be think, okay, give this to someone else because we don't want to deal with it. And one could say that, much as it's clear that if Lopez Obrador had not won this election, the social outcomes would have been severe, and it could have been really quite serious compared to what happened in 2006 when he basically won the election. And it's lucky that things didn't become, much more violent, or depending on how you see it, I suppose, lucky. But it does say something about this the position he's in now, given that the situation around the drug war has been seen as almost unmanageable or unsolutionable, and now Lopez Obrador is allowed to lead the country. Now the left is allowed to lead the country at a moment when, the elites no longer feel that they can do anything to solve the problem. Another thing that's been circulating on social media that I found really sort of, evocative or whatever, is, that people are wanting to watch, is the speech that Lopez Obrador has given to all of the New Morena deputies and representatives across the country at a recent meeting, where he went on for quite a while about how he was not going to tolerate any kind of corruption. And so this has sort of circulated a lot as kind of, look, he's serious about really trying to root out this problem. And so it's giving a lot of people, I think, a sense of optimism about the future, that, he is serious in his commitment to, as he said on election night, I want to go down in history as being a good president of this country, which I think he probably really does mean. But what was also interesting on election night, and what I'm particularly concerned with, because of the area of the context that sort of my research pertains to, is what he's saying around the energy reform. So basically, throughout the campaign, one of the things that Lopez Obrador has committed to is a reversal of the 2013 energy reform, which allowed transnational firms in sort of at an extreme level. So there's been sort of surreptitious privatization of the Mexican oil industry for decades, but the 2013 reform was particularly significant in that it started, to auction off to main transnational firms, including the ones that were actually kicked out of the country after 1938, are now able to come in and actually have operating rights and are able to book reserves in Mexico based on their having won particular spaces in auction. And so this includes Shell and ExxonMobil, both of which would be the subsidiaries of the firms that were expropriated, the main firms that were expropriated in the 30s, El Águila and La Huasteca. I don't know to what extent certainly lots of Mexicans are aware of the fact that these same firms have returned, but to what extent there's sort of a sense that these are the specific companies, I think is another issue. And I think López Obrador was very careful on election night to say that whatever changes we make will be by the rule of law. We will make them in the courts. Whatever challenges we make to the petroleum reform will be in the courts. Since then, the person that he has indicated he will appoint as energy minister, Rocío Nale, has said, well, the energy reform is what there is. We're not going backwards. We're going to move forward with what the existing legislation is. And I think this is, somewhat disappointing, but I suppose not surprising, because to be honest, if he had been willing to push that forward in an aggressive way, I'm not so sure that he would have been sort of permitted to win the elections. That I think that the interest or the attitude that one sees from the West is very much dependent on his willingness to at least go along with a significant number of those reforms, and certainly not reverse existing contracts that have been given. So in terms of sort of from a kind of a resource nationalist perspective, I'm not especially optimistic about what the future will hold there. But what might happen, and I think is sort of might be the best one can expect, would be perhaps a change in the way the regulatory structure has been established around that industry, and perhaps some slowing down of the contracting process. Now, in this process, TransCanada Pipelines is a major actor. So, one of the main effects of the 2013 reform was to reverse the historic balance of trade and energy imports and exports between Mexico and the United States. And Mexico was a net exporter of petroleum products to the United States for the last couple of decades. And as of 2015, that relationship reversed. Mexico is now a net importer of petroleum products, primarily natural gas, that is fueling the energy grid in Mexico, and a big actor in constructing the new infrastructure to make that possible is TransCanada Pipelines, also ATCO, and a lot of Export Development Canada financing to a series of different Canadian firms that are directly involved with that. There have been protests in various parts of Mexico against these particular projects. But certainly a few years ago, in 2014, when TransCanada was particularly sort of trumpeting its new contracts in Mexico as making up for canceled projects, at that point, one of the things that they were really highlighting was that Mexico was making up for the fact that other projects weren't going through. But don't worry, in Mexico, we're not facing the same kind of social opposition we're facing here. And so, the fact that there is a rising opposition to those projects and various TransCanada projects have been delayed does say something about where this could go. One of the groups that López Obrador was a leader of, a kind of a consumer group in the south east of Mexico, in the Gulf Coast area, called La Resistencia Civil, that was active throughout the 90s and still remains active. It's basically people who refuse to pay their electricity tariffs. They also actively supported the PRD. López Obrador ran as governor of Tabasco State years ago, and that election was also sort of stolen in irregularities to Madrazo, who he then ran against, who didn't, for the it was the PAN who won, but in 2000, and it was in the 2006, I guess. I'm losing track of which election it was. But in any case, he ran against Madrazo both at the state level and federally. And one of the things that made them both sort of powerful was the fact that they came out of the oil-producing areas. And López Obrador and the Resistencia Civil that he represented were people who were saying, energy is ours, right? So they were sort of putting into practice the direct meaning of the nationalization of resources under the 1917 Constitution. It's like that you can't charge us for energy. This is our energy. And what's one of the things that has been touted by companies like TransCanada and by the Mexican Federal Electrical Commission, which laid off 40,000 people in 2009, I guess it was, as they started to privatize the electricity sector. One of the things that they really stressed was that, actually the overall tariffs for electricity are going to go down under the energy reform. Well, the reality is that in many parts of the countryside, people were not paying for energy because they were taking energy from the grid. They were, basically cutting the cord and bringing it directly to their house, and good for them. And this is across the country. And one of the things that they're now promoting is a very sort of, kind of neoliberal consumer model where people will have to pay in advance for their electricity quota, and when it runs out, they won't have, they'll no longer have access to electricity. So they're modernizing the system in such a way that people's ability to sort of get direct access to electricity will be reduced. So the extent to which this regime will be able to sort of reverse that, I think, is, we'll have to see. But there are points of optimism. Adelfo Regino Montes, who is a Oaxacan Mije intellectual, is going to be the Indigenous Affairs, the new body that López Obrador says he's going to establish. He will be the director of that. But the last week, and this is also circulating a lot in the Mexican media, Subcomandante Galeano, who's Marcos and Moises, put out a statement basically saying, the game had already been sort of set before the election happened. The fact that all of the parties were, more or less congratulating him and agreeing to this election meant that there had been a sort of an agreement with international capital, is the implication that they made. That, you might have changed the referees, but you haven't changed the owner of the space. So, he said.